Aloha and welcome to yet another Premiere tutorial. I think this is the 17th one I've recorded, although at this point the order becomes a little bit irrelevant. What I want to talk about this time is sequences. We've been working with them, but we haven't really addressed them. And I'm sorry to say that this one's going to get a little bit technical. Okay, I can hear what you're thinking. Oh my God, Tom, are you telling me that what we've done so far hasn't been technical? Yeah, that's kind of what I'm telling you. This one's going to be a little bit deeper. Anyway, let's get to it. So here's my poking around project that I've been using for these tutorials. I've cleaned it out a bit, and I've also imported some additional footage. So we have things here that you've seen before. I've got footage from the coffee project, right? Scott's perfect cup of coffee here. And I've also got some, now I chose this because it's standard definition. We've got some footage here from the Cloning Michael project, which you've watched me work, and maybe you've worked yourself. This is high definition footage. And then I've got a little bit of footage from a film called The Heart That Binds that I worked on not too long ago. You've seen a couple of shots in the cloning episode. I showed you how I removed a light switch in that one. This was shot in UHD, ultra high definition. So at the moment, I have an empty timeline, and you'll see it even has the words no sequences there. So there's nothing in the timeline. There are no sequences put together. And what we've been doing so far is whenever we wanted to make a sequence, we would simply start by taking a clip, double click a clip there, and then we would drag it down into this empty space on the timeline. And when we did that, a lot of things would happen, right? The timeline gets full of icons and information. Video pops up here in the program window, but also down here in my project window, you'll see that a new item has appeared. And this is called Stand Up One because the file that I dragged over there is called Stand Up One. I'm going to move this so that it's in the same bin as the coffee footage. And there we go. Here we have, if you look at what I have highlighted, this is Stand Up One, the sequence. And you can tell it's a sequence by looking at the icon there. It's a little bit different. And this is Stand Up One, the video file. This is the file that we're looking at up here in the preview window. They have the same name because I created the sequence by dragging this file onto the timeline. And this inevitably gets confusing to me. So one of the very first things I do after I've created a sequence is I click on it and I rename it. And I'm just going to call this coffee sequence. And you'll notice that not only did it change the name here, it changes the name on the timeline. Now, if we look at the settings, I've got my metadata arranged here to show you the stuff I consider useful. You'll see that both the file and the sequence have got the same frame rates, 29.97 frames per second. That's what I run home to as a television production person. You'll notice that they have the same dimensions, 720 by 480. They're both standard definition video, and that they are both 48 kilohertz sample rate, which again is the standard. 48 kilohertz 16-bit is the standard audio sample rate for digital video. You'll notice there's a little bit of discrepancy in that the sequence presents itself as stereo, while the individual files present themselves as two-channel mono. And that's just a discrepancy that we're not going to explore in this video. It's one of the things about Premiere that irritates me quite a bit. Okay, so I'm going to close this sequence by clicking the little X behind it, go back to my empty timeline. And then let me close this bin down, and we're going to open the Cloning Michael exercise. And we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to start with a piece of video, and I'm going to drag it down here into this empty timeline. And in doing so, it's going to create a sequence. All right. And the sequence is named Daisy 137_01 because that's the name of the video file that I dragged into it. And again, I'm just going to move this sequence into the same bin so that there's my sequence, there's my clip. And again, I'm going to rename this, and I'm going to call this Michael sequence. All right, and you'll notice Michael's sequence, again, has got the same settings. 29.97 frames per second, both in the sequence and all of the video clips. 1920 by 1080, standard high definition there. 48 kilohertz sample rate. And again, you'll notice there's a little bit of a discrepancy here in that it presents itself as stereo, where the video files present themselves as stereo mapped to 2-channel mono. Don't sweat it. Maybe we'll talk about that in a future video. Probably not, but maybe. All right, and again, I'm going to close this one. And then the reason I keep closing them is because I want to have an empty timeline, completely empty, into which to drag video and create a sequence. But I can do this a different way, actually. Let me show you that as well. If I take a piece of video out of the Heart That Binds here, rather than dragging it into this empty timeline, down here in the bottom right-hand corner of this bottom left-hand panel, there's an icon that looks like a folded piece of paper. This is the new item icon. And if I click on this, there's a list of new things that I can create. I can create a new sequence, which is what we'll be doing in a short period of time. Adjustment layers come in handy. I think you've seen me work with those. Leader for counting down, bars and tone. There's a lot of useful stuff in here. But ignoring that for the minute, what I can actually do is I can take a video clip and drag it onto this little icon, and it will create a new sequence for me as well. And it won't be any different than what I was doing earlier. And notice, here's my sequence, and here's my video file. Again, they have the same name. And I'm just going to rename that real quickly and call it Heart Sequence. All right. And you'll notice that the Heart sequence has the same frame rate, 23.976. So this was shot for a more cinematic project. You'll see that the aspect ratio, the overall pixel size is the same, 3840 by 2160, ultra high definition. And again, 48 kilohertz sample rate. Just to have a little bit of reference to look at, I'm going to go ahead and open these other two sequences that I made. What did we call this one? This was Coffee Sequence. I'll just double click that. I'll close that bin up. And cloning Michael, it was Michael Sequence. Okay, so now I have these three different sequences in my timeline, and I can move back and forth between them by clicking on the tab for each one. You might not have had cause to do this so far. So at the moment, everything's fine. My Heart sequence is in ultra high definition. The footage is in ultra high definition. My Coffee sequence is in standard definition. All the footage is standard definition. My Michael sequence is in high definition. All the footage is in high definition. So as long as I'm working within one of those, everything comes out nice. But let's look at what happens if I start to mix and match. So here on the Michael sequence, I'm going to put a shot from the Coffee project in. Here, I'll just grab a little close-up of the beans that I happen to have an in and an out point marked for. And I'm just going to drag this down onto the timeline here. All right, so you'll notice my Michael footage all looks normal. And then when I get to the coffee bean footage, it's tiny. It's this itty-bitty square in the middle of this large black area. Okay, that's because it's literally a smaller image. It's a standard definition image being displayed on a high definition screen. So you can see this might present a problem for me. I could scale it up, but if this is not what I expected to happen, I have some troubleshooting to do. Let's take a look at what happens if we go the other way. If I take this ultra high definition shot and drag it onto a high definition timeline. Okay, it's too big for the frame. Look at how much it has zoomed in. Okay, so this in the left hand in my preview window, this is what the shot originally looked like coming out of the camera. But here on the edited side, because I've taken a large format, an ultra high definition format, and dropped it on a medium-sized sequence, a high definition sequence, it's as if I've zoomed in on it, which comes in handy, but it's not what we wanted to have happen. So making sure that your sequence lines up with your footage is kind of important. Now, As long as you're only working with footage from one source, from one camera, this rarely becomes an issue. But if you're working with footage from multiple different sources, maybe stuff you downloaded from YouTube, maybe you shot on more than one camera and the resolutions weren't matched up, you need to pay attention to what you're doing. Now, if I were to take this sequence and delete everything from it, I still have my Michael sequence here. It still exists. There's simply nothing in it. Now watch this. I'm going to take this I'm going to take this ultra high definition shot and drop it onto this high definition sequence. So these don't match. And when I make this edit, I get a warning message. The warning message: this clip does not match the sequence's setting. Change sequence to match the clip settings? ? It's telling me that things don't line up, and it's offering to fix it for me. And it would fix it by changing the sequence settings. So the sequence would now become a UHD sequence rather than an HD sequence. Ultra high definition rather than high definition. It only offers to do this on the very first edit. The very first time you drop a piece of video into an empty sequence, if they don't match, it'll make this offer. After that, it'll never offer again. It'll never bother you again. Now, I could go either way. I could tell it to change the sequence settings, assuming I was going to keep editing everything and I wanted it to be in UHD. Or I could tell it to keep the existing settings and pretend like I knew what I was doing. I actually want to scale this down to HD. This is a great warning just because it forces you to take a moment and stop to think, should I change it or not? So in this particular case, I'm going to keep the existing settings. When I edited this movie, the release version was going to be in high definition. Even though we shot it in ultra high definition, when I edited it, it got scaled down to high definition, and this was by choice. It's also cool because it allows us to deliberately do what you're seeing here by working with the scale control. Right, I have to scale this thing down to 50%. Before it actually fits on the screen. But that means I can run my scaling up and reframe it without worrying about losing any resolution. As long as my scale is under 100%, I haven't lost any information. So this is really pretty cool. It's a way I can create zooms that were not shot with the camera. I can create camera motion that wasn't there originally. All right. But it all depends on having the sequence configured correctly before you start editing. So if all I had was the footage from the heart, all of the footage that I have available is in ultra high definition, how do I create a timeline, a sequence that's just high definition? Or that's 2K DCI, or that's standard definition. How do I create a sequence that has different settings than the footage I've got to work with? All right, let's get to this. Now, I showed you one way already. If I come down and click on the new item icon, I get that little pop-up menu, and sequence is one option. If I click on that, it'll open up the new sequence dialog box. I can get to the same place a different way, just to show you for completeness sake. If I go into the File menu and highlight the word New, I get a lot of options, including a new sequence. Or you can see that there's a keystroke shortcut, Command N. And this also will take me to the new sequence dialog box. So I'm going to go ahead and click this. Welcome to the new sequence dialog box. This is one of the clumsiest, worst interfaces in Premiere. And Adobe agrees. It's clumsy and it doesn't work very well. They are trying to come up with a way to redesign it. At least that's what they say on the public forums. We're trying to come up with a way to redesign it. So I really hope that they do. Let's take a look at what's here already. Let me close that little tab down. So there are a decent number of presets here available. And if you've got a sharp eye, you might have already spotted the fact that many of these have camera names attached to them. Arri is a camera name. If you are working with really high budget stuff, if you're ever lucky enough to shoot with an Arri, enjoy the experience. Moving on down, Canon is a camera name, camera manufacturer name. Red, another high-end camera manufacturer. If you know a little bit more about cameras and about the technology on how they work, you'll recognize XD. XD Cam is a Sony format. So these three options here are presets for Sony cameras. Maybe you're working with a digital SLR. There are presets here for the digital SLR world. If you're working on a consumer-grade camera, odds are excellent that it's shooting in a compressed format called AVC HD, in which case there's presets here for AVC HD. And you get the idea. There's just a ton of presets here. And if you open any one of these triangles, you'll see that there are more choices. In this one, I actually have categories. So maybe my AVC HD was shot in high definition with a progressive scan, so 1080p. I open that one up, and I can see that there are a number of options here for 24 frames per second with different pixel aspect ratios, 25 frames per second, 30, 50, 60 frames per second. Now, way down here at the bottom, there's a folder that says Custom. And maybe you think this allows you to make custom sequences. It's a reasonable thing to think, but it's actually not what it does. This is where you keep customs that you've already saved. So if I look in here, I can see that I have saved 3 customs before. So this bottom one is one I saved for a film called Now or Never. And if I click on it, I can see the specifics here in this lower window. So this one is set for 23.976 frames per second at 1920 by 1080. All right, so this was shot in high definition, but using a filmic frame rate. And up here you can see a description that I typed for it at the time. Here's one that's a generic high definition one. And 29.97, that's a good American television standard. 1920 by 1080. And you can see that I've given myself a note here. So let's talk about how we would actually make a new one. Once I've selected a preset, let me not select a preset. Notice that at the moment I cannot get to this option for settings, and I cannot get to this option for tracks. This is annoying as heck. You cannot simply start to create a sequence and give it settings. You have to start with a preset, and you have to modify that preset. And what's even more annoying is that it matters to some degree what preset you choose. Any one of these presets I choose is going to limit my options further down the road. So sometimes I actually have to start over more than once when I'm looking for something specific. Just before I move on, these two right here, these DNX ones, DNX HD and DNX HR, if you're editing on a PC, these are your friends. These are the presets which will give you the settings that are most compatible with working on a PC. This guy, ProRes RAW, if you're working on an Apple computer, this preset will give you the settings that are most useful for Apple. So I'm editing on an Apple. This is where I'm going to start. I'm going to open it up, and I only have the option for 4K, but again, I'm going to change almost everything about this preset. So it almost doesn't matter which preset I choose, almost. Now, just because I know that the footage I'm editing, this Heart That Binds footage, is shot in 23.976, I'm going to pick this top one because it has the same frame rate, 23.976. It's one change I won't have to make. Now that I've selected a preset, which I have no intention of using, I can go in and start to modify it. Because as soon as I selected a preset, you'll notice that I have the option to go into my settings. Now here in settings, and also we'll go into the tracks in a minute, but here in settings, there's a bunch of things, and about half of these are important. Now this editing mode by default is the same thing that I selected earlier, ProRes RAW. But if I drop this down, you'll see that I have pretty much all the same list of presets as I had on the other. In fact, this expanded. There are more of them. But again, we've got the same things. Here are my Sony XD cams hanging out at the bottom. There's my Red camera. Let's see, there's my Canon camera. Up here at the top, we'll find the Arri. There's AVC HD. So all these things are still here. So I could re-choose any of them. But up at the very top, and you have to look for it, it's not alphabetical under the C's, but you have to scroll all the way to the very top, is the custom option. And that's what I'm going to click on. Now, once I've gone into this, it's going to open up a lot of choices. Not all the choices, but a lot of them. So my time base is already set for 23.976. But if I drop this down, you'll see that I have quite a list I could choose from. So if I were changing my mind, if I wanted to master this at 30 frames a second, or at 59.94, or at 10 frames a second, I could rechange those at this time. I'm going to leave it at 23.976. I want my new sequence to match my footage in terms of frame rate. Frame size. Now, it has given me something that's different. Because I went to this custom thing, it's kind of, well, it's done its own thing a little bit. But I want to edit this as high definition. So I'm going to change that to 1920 by 1080. And yes, you actually have to type these numbers in by hand, which means you have to know what the numbers are. And yes, this is an excellent place to make a mistake that will haunt you for the rest of your editing session. So pay attention. Make sure you type in the correct numbers and make sure they're still there. In a minute, I'm going to change some options around, and sometimes stuff changes behind your back. The pixel aspect ratio, this is the shape of the pixels. Generally speaking, unless you know specifically you should change it, leave it set to square pixels. This one feels. If you shot progressive scan, and almost every camera, every modern camera shoots progressive scan by default these days, leave it be. But if you know that you shot as an interlaced scan and you want to preserve that while you're editing, you can drop this down and you can choose these two for interlaced. And usually it's upper field first is the correct one to choose. If you don't know, don't change it. Just leave it set to no fields, or make sure that it's set to no fields progressive scan. This is a little bit strange. You have an option to change the way the time is displayed on your computer monitor. But if you're editing with this time base and you're editing in video, there's not really any reason to do this. If you are actually conforming film, like actual film, like a strip of nylon that went through a bunch of chemicals film, you could do it with feet plus frames. Yeah, these are options that just serve to confuse you for the most part. And then this working color space. I've only got 3 options here, but depending on how you've configured your system, you might see different ones. REC 709 is, at least today, the universal standard for how high definition displays work. So the odds are something like 99% that whoever's watching my video is going to be watching it in this color space, REC 709. So yes, I'm going to leave that alone. Sample rate, 48 kilohertz. That's where it should be. This is the standard for digital video. The only thing that might change is if for some reason I was using Premiere to edit audio, to like edit a music track, I might drop it down to 44.1. That's the standard for CD quality digital audio. But 48 kilohertz is where I'm going to leave it. And this one, audio display samples, just talks about how the timeline shows things, whether it shows the individual sample or milliseconds. I'm going to leave that alone. Okay, this bottom section starts to look scary because there's some complicated looking things here in the drop down. This talks about video previews, which means when you render a file, what Premiere is actually doing is it's taking the video file along with whatever special effects or color correction or graphics, whatever it is that you did to it that means it has to be rendered. It's actually it's creating a new video file. That's what the render is a new video file that has all of that extra information baked in. So if I were to take this shot I'm looking at right now and to shrink it down and then put a color effect on it and then put a title on the screen, it would need to be rendered. And when I render it, there would actually be a new video file that had all three of those elements combined, plus the original video. What it's asking you here is, what format should I record those video files as? And on the one hand, it doesn't matter. It honestly doesn't matter. If your computer can render and play back and everything looks good, however this is set is fine. But you can hedge your bets. If you're editing on a Mac, you'll want to go with this QuickTime option. If you're editing on a PC, probably the Cineform is not a bad choice. You can experiment with different ones and see. The idea here is that once the file is rendered, it should be easier for your computer to play it back. So if you experience something where you're rendering and it actually gets slower to play it back, you just need to choose a different one. So I'm going to go ahead and choose QuickTime here. And having chosen QuickTime, it's going to prompt me to choose the specifics of what flavor of QuickTime. How do I want to do this? Now, again, this is only for previews. This has got nothing to do with your final product. This only is for you staring at the screen while you're in the process of editing. So to my way of thinking, I need something that's going to be as fast for the computer as possible, so the computer is responsive and the keystrokes don't delay. Like when I press play, it plays instantly. There's not a hesitation between playing and stopping. But at the same time, I don't want to waste hard drive space. So I'm going to choose something that's Apple friendly, but not ridiculously large. And in this particular case, what I'm going to go with is Apple ProRes 422 LT. Okay, so Apple means Apple. ProRes is sort of a generic term for Apple's high quality video. 422 talks about how the color is processed. So this is actually a 422 chroma subsampling. Don't worry about it. We'll talk about it in COM 330. And then the LT stands for light. So you can see I've got three flavors, actually four flavors of this right here. I've got average everyday ProRes 422. I've got ProRes 422 high quality, which throws even more data at it, which means even larger video files. ProRes 422 Lite, which is obviously scaled down. And then for ProRes 422 Proxy is actually the smallest video file I can make, but it's really quite low quality. It's designed for quick and easy playback without any real accuracy of the color. And that just scares me. I don't want to be making color decisions based on a low quality render. So here we go. I'm going to choose that 422 LT. Just double check here. This is 1920 by 1080. It matches my numbers up here, 1920 by 1080. Okay. We're 2/3 of the way home. Now I'm going to move over here to this Tracks tab. It is a personal preference of mine, and this again comes from the way I learned as I was coming up. I do not like editing with stereo audio tracks. I like editing to mono audio tracks. I can still create a stereo effect using mono audio tracks. I don't lose any capabilities. But what this does is when I bring my video footage in, if there are two channels of audio attached to it, it treats them as mono channel 1 and mono channel 2, which means I can operate them independently. If it was stereo, it would mix those two into a single stereo track, which means if I had one microphone on one talent and a second microphone on a second talent, I'd have a harder time manipulating those independently. And that's pretty much just standard in film and video production. So anyway, I'm going to switch this to mono. Another thing that annoys me about Premiere is that this is the one and only moment I have to make this decision. Once I've created the sequence, I can go back and change all of these settings on the Settings tab. After I've created the sequence, I can change all of this. I can change the frame rate. I can change the frame size. I can change the encoding for previews. I can change the pixel shape. I can change from progressive to interlaced. I can literally change everything about it, except what's on this Tracks tab. Once I've created the sequence, I can't change it from a mono sequence into a stereo sequence, or I can't change it from a stereo sequence to a mono sequence. I'm stuck with it unless I make a new sequence and just copy all of the content over. So I always like to make sure that I'm going to get that correctly. All right, and I am going to call this, I'm going to give it a useful name, and this is going to be my heart HD sequence. So this is for the heart that binds, but it's in high definition. But before I click OK, I have an option here to save this preset, which might come in handy. So I'm going to go ahead and hit Save Preset. And it's going to open this dialog box. I'm sorry, that popped up on my other monitor there. And I am going to call this one UHD to HD 23.976. So that tells me what the sequence is. And honestly, you know what? I'm not going to even call it that. I'm just going to call it HD 23.976. So now I know I have a shortcut for HD at 23.976. And I'm going to put a note in here that says ProRes 422 LT previews. All right. Cool. So I'll click OK. And this will take just a second as it throws that preview. And there we have it. There's a preset custom that I just created. So now I can create my heart HD sequence using this HD 23.976. Okay. All right. And let me close these other ones real quick. So there we go. Here's the sequence I'm going to be editing on. And if I've done everything right, when I drag my first piece of video over here, it should give me that warning because I'm dragging UHD footage onto an HD timeline. And it did. It gave me the warning. But I know what I'm doing when I keep my existing settings. All right.
No!
And now, of course, I'll proceed with actually editing this thing. I'm going to end up, everything that I put on here, I'm going to end up scaling down, right? So I'll go ahead and just scale this down to 50% to start with. I'll probably end up zooming in a little bit, right? There's some dead space up here above her head and some dead space to either side that I don't really need. So maybe I'll just run this guy up to, I don't know, 70% or so. And slide it to the right a little bit. Isn't that nice, the way I can just reframe that because it was shot with a higher resolution? Opens up a lot of possibilities. Okay, one more thing that I want to show you just because I mentioned it. If I get down the road and I realize I've made a mistake, I wasn't thinking, I did not want to edit this in HD, I wanted to edit this in 2K. I got something wrong, or I later changed my mind. I can actually change almost everything on this. Like I said, all I have to do is have my sequence selected, and I can either do that by having the timeline active or by coming over here and finding my heart HD sequence in the project and selecting it there. Either way, as long as it's selected, I can go into the sequence menu, and the first setting here, the first option is sequence settings. And when I open that, it will give me the sequence settings, the same menu that I used to create. So again, at this point, I could go back to any of the presets that existed before. I could change my frame rate to a different frame rate. I can change my frame size to a different frame size. So let's do that. I'm going to change this to 2,000 pixels wide, but only 1,000 pixels tall. And I will call this the Tom format. This is a 2x1, which is actually about standard for Hollywood movies, action movies anyway. So once I hit OK, we should see this program monitor reshape itself a little bit. Again, notice I can literally change everything that I set up before, with the exception of making it stereo or making it mono. That's the only thing that is locked in stone. Okay, I'm going to click OK. Let's see what happens. it gives me a warning message, and this is a good warning message. It's telling me that any preview files I've generated, any render files that I have done so far are now useless, and they're going to be discarded because they're useless. And it can't be undone. That sounds scary, doesn't it? Don't worry about it. All you have to do is re-render. So I'm going to click OK. And sure enough, it cropped my image a little bit. So it got wider and it got shorter vertically. So that adjustment I did before is now cropping the top of her head off. So maybe I'll go back to my effect controls. And I could either slide her down in the frame a little bit. No, I don't think I like that. I think I will instead zoom out just a little bit. Have to be careful. I don't want to go off the edge of the screen there. So for most of what you're going to do, and pretty much actually for everything you're going to do in my class, you can create a new sequence safely just by grabbing a piece of video and dropping it on a blank timeline. And probably that will work out fine. The only reason it wouldn't work out fine is if the first piece of video that you drop on it is somehow different than other pieces of video. If you've shot with more than one camera, or if you've imported footage from another source, again, you've downloaded it from YouTube, or you have a still image that you've brought in from the web, make sure that the first thing you put on that timeline is a piece of video that has the shape and size of what you want the whole project to be. Right, so if you shot 80% of your video using your cell phone, but downloaded 20% of the video from a stock footage site, I would start by putting a piece of video from your phone on the timeline. Even if it's not going to be the first shot in your sequence, that doesn't matter. What you want is to create the sequence settings that match that type of video, because it's going to be most of your project. And then you can scale the other video to fit appropriately. I've seen students who started out, they downloaded a JPEG image, like maybe they were doing a sports drink, and they downloaded a logo for the sports drink. We'll call it Tom's Sports Drink, whatever. But when they dragged their video into the empty timeline to create the sequence, the first thing that they dragged in was the first thing they wanted us to see, which was the JPEG logo. So they ended up with a timeline that was like 100 pixels by 100 pixels. And suddenly all of the video had to be squashed way down in order to fit. So what I would have recommended in that case is create the sequence by dragging your cell phone video or your camera video onto the timeline first, and then just move stuff around so that you can put that JPEG image at the beginning. In the rare case where you shot in one format and you know for a fact you're delivering in another format, you have to set the sequence up by hand like you watched me doing. And it's a little bit of a clumsy process. If you felt like it was a clumsy process while you were watching me do it, you're right on the money, because it is a clumsy process. It's a terrible interface, and I just can't wait for Adobe to do something better. It's cluttered up with so many presets that it's almost unusable. It's almost impossible to find a preset that actually does what you want. And you can't create your own without starting with one of the presets that you don't want and then modifying it. There ought to be a way to just create one with your own settings from the get-go, but, well, we can hope. All right. This is not fun, but this is reality. There are times when you have to do this by hand, and there's no substitute other than typing in the numbers by hand and making sure you know what the numbers are supposed to be and getting them right. So, all right. That's all I have to say about that.